Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Gabby Grzybowski, Gabriela Grzybowski. I am one of the co-founders of Linguati, which is a subscription library of Polish children's books in the US. And so what we do is actually we provide a service of sending Polish kids' books straight to your home. You get to loan them out for as long as you want. Once you return them, you get your new set of books. And so what we really are doing, what we're really passionate about at Linguati is promoting Polish bilingualism here in the States, and providing resources for other families like ours that want to make sure that they have access to books and games in Polish for their kids. And today we're here with Ciara Grogan, and I'm going to let her do her intro.
Thank you so much, Gabby. Dzień dobry. My name is Ciara. I live in Queens, New York. I'm married. I have 2 children of my own. I'm a speech pathologist. I primarily work with complex communicators and early language learners in the 0 to 3 population within a hospital setting. And I also take on private clients, and I've worked extensively in early intervention in New York City for the past 9 years. To give a little bit of background about myself, my mother is Polish American. My father's Irish American. My mom's family emigrated here after World War II as refugees and settled actually down in the American South of all places. So there is a Polonia down in Charlotte, North Carolina that was actually started by my grandparents. And they had the language journey for them was complicated. Back in those days, you did not speak to your child in your native language. You were pushed to speak English and become American very quickly. So my mother actually understands Polish but doesn't speak it, and so does her brother. And my grandparents still are fluent speakers. And then when I met my husband, who's actually Polish born, I picked up the language, speaking to him, speaking to Polish friends, and we're actually raising our children bilingually, Polish at home, English, and Polish at school, since my older daughter attends a dual language Polish-English program here in Queens. So I come to this conversation not only as a professional speech pathologist, but also as a bilingual person and a bilingual parent. I'll add a little bit more that Gabby just reminded me of, is that I also speak French and Spanish, and I have worked in those languages in my career as well. So I feel very fortunate to have been able to work with and provide services and support lots of families and children on their communication journeys who are also multilingual.
And it's really interesting, I think, when we first talked, me and Ciara, about what your bilingualism journey was like. So interesting. And I think it's so amazing that you effectively are a second generation, your kids are third generation, and you've been able to keep the language or relearn it almost, and reintroduce it into your family, because that's actually really, really hard to do. I think, I don't know the exact numbers, but typically, first generation kids are able to keep the language, especially nowadays, because it's definitely a bit of a different environment than when your grandparents first came here. But it is still a big challenge because there's not as much of a need, right? And having a need to speak that language is a really big kind of propeller for why people do keep their home language when everything else here in the US, for the most part, is in English. So it's just really, really, really fascinating. And I thought that was so cool that you guys have been able to do that.
Well, it has been, I do have to say, is I think to kind of just start the conversation bilingualism takes commitment. It takes, whether you have immigrated here yourself and you want to speak your native language to your child, whether you speak another language that you want to pass on to your child, if you were born here or that you learned on your own. I think even if you don't consciously sit down and find a plan, you always will have some kind of idea in your head of what you want your child to accomplish and what you want them to achieve. And that's different for every family. That looks different for every person. One of the biggest myths I see perpetuated about bilingual and multilingual language learners is that it has to be perfect, that when we say bilingual, we're talking about somebody who perfectly speaks the first language and who perfectly speaks the second language. And in all situations, in every single context, with every single person, that is a myth. That is not how bilingualism works. I'm sure Gabby yourself, you can understand, like there's certain times like the reason we're having this conversation in English right now, for example, is I have such a hard time explaining these things in Polish. It's not my first language, and I've never had to work at a very, very high level in that. I do have some things I talk about with families, and when I've worked in early intervention with Polish speaking families, I have learned the vocabulary and like explain things, and we've had a good rapport, but it's been years since I've done that. So that has kind of flown out of my brain right now. I would have to look at it again to remember the words, remember the vocabulary, to go back to it. And that's very common. And that happens to all of us. How many times have we heard people say, oh, when I was little, I only spoke this language. And then once I started school, I forgot it. I don't speak it anymore. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
Bilingualism is not something that is static. It's dynamic, and it's constantly changing depending on the situation, depending on your age, depending on what you feel comfortable with.
Yeah. No, and I definitely, resonate with that. I mean, my Polish, again, my mom and my father were born in Poland. They came here as adults, and, my mom only spoke to us in Polish, and still really only, well, now she uses Polish because she knows enough English that she uses a mix oftentimes. And you don't even realize it, which is really funny. That's like the funniest thing that I've noticed, because she'll talk to family in Poland and she doesn't even realize that she's using English words at this point when she's speaking to them. I'm like, Mom, they don't know what that means because you're talking in English. She's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, you just said X word, right? And she's like, oh, I didn't even. and if you ask her if she speaks English, she'll be like, no, I don't speak English. I'm like, okay, Mom. So it's really funny because even for, people who do immigrate here and they don't think their English is that strong, they actually end up using a lot of those words in their Polish and in their communication. And so same thing with us, right? Depending on what you're exposed to and what you are used to using, that's what you become more comfortable with. And so for me, what's been really interesting is, I grew up at home. I didn't go to school until kindergarten and half-day kindergarten, when that was more of a thing than nowadays. And really only spoke Polish at home. But once we went to school, we obviously learned English. And English is my stronger language. I mean, I do everything in English. I went to school in English. Most of my friends speak English. I've been working for over 10 years now in my profession, and I speak pretty much always in English to everyone. I do have opportunities to speak in Polish. Like this week, actually, we had some people coming from our Warsaw office, and I got to talk to them in Polish. But it's very few times that I actually get to do that. It's mostly everything in English. So when we had our kids, we knew we really wanted them to speak Polish. And I mean, we have some higher goals for them. We're really hoping that they're able to read and write in Polish as well. Not maybe novels or paragraphs, but at least to be able to do the basics. And it's funny because, again, my Polish has actually improved so much from when we had my first, because we're always reading with them. And so that's been really interesting to see, even for myself, because my vocabulary has increased. My mom is like, oh my gosh, your Polish is just getting better and better. It's really interesting to see that change. And I'm in my 30s now. I'm not a young child, obviously. And so it's just really interesting to see how that kind of goes up and down. And it takes a lot of commitment from the parents, of course, because my mom definitely did do a lot of things at home, small things to keep that language up. But also now as an adult, it's my choice, right, to want to be able to do that. And so I think the flip side of that is we as parents can do what we can to lay the foundation.
Absolutely.
For, our home language. And for us, that's Polish, obviously. But also recognize that eventually these people do grow up and leave your house. And they'll get to decide how much they actually want to continue using it and keep it as a part of their life.
Yeah, I think once again, that's just a perfect illustration of just that yo-yo, right? Or that rubber band of bilingualism of sometimes we're stretching it and we're doing all the things, and sometimes we aren't really using that part of our brain, and we're not using that language so often. So we have to kind of remember or like reinvent it for ourselves, as you mentioned with your kids, where now that you're reading it and you're having to teach it to somebody else, it forces you to kind of up your game a little bit, because you don't want them to learn something that is incorrect. I think I feel very privileged to have that opportunity to pass this on to my children in the way that I'm doing it. I know that for other families, it's a little bit different, where maybe they don't have a choice. Maybe this is the only language the parents speak and they don't speak English. So this is their way of providing bilingualism to their child, even if it's I might say not unintentional, but it is just what it has to be in order for the child to connect and communicate with their family. So, once again, whenever I'll just speak from my professional perspective of, say, I get a referral for early intervention. Early intervention is a program that is available in every single state. It is federally mandated to provide services to children ages 0 through 3 who have demonstrated delays within different domains. These domains include speech and language, physical development, fine motor, or what we call occupational development. The occupation of a child is play, so it's generally like play and fine motor, as well as instruction, which is like teaching, basically. Some states also do vision and feeding therapy, but every state is different.
Okay.
So I myself worked in New York State. If you're a bilingual or multilingual clinician, you don't need a special certification to work in early intervention. So I would get referrals for kids speaking a variety of languages, not always the ones that I speak either. So that's a different conversation to be had with professionals. But whenever I get a referral for cases where a child's exposed to 2-3 languages every day, it's really important for us as professionals to really get a judgment-free picture of what this child's day looks like, to get a judgment-free picture of when you as the parent, when are you speaking this language? When are you speaking that language? Is it only one language? And it is, you as the parent have the right to have a judgment-free and a professional, I guess, kind of, assessment that doesn't, I guess, impose on what's going on in your life. Trying to keep this, trying to keep this language accessible for people. You shouldn't have somebody coming into your house telling you, okay, stop speaking your language to your child.
Yeah.
That's another that I often have to bust for these parents is bilingualism or multilingual exposure does not cause any kind of language delay.
Yes. Amen.
I'm 9-10 years in the field. I've worked in a variety of settings. I cannot name for you a single child that I've worked with that was delayed or had a disorder that was due to them being bilingual or multilingual. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
What I do see often is misinformation provided to families. I do see often parents who are worried and scared about what's going on with their child and doing what they think is the best thing for them in that moment, because they love their child so much. They want to provide them with what they think is the best opportunity for them as they grow up.
Yep.
So even for a child who's maybe diagnosed with autism, a child who's diagnosed with a genetic syndrome, a child who is what I would call a complex communicator that maybe doesn't even use verbal speech to communicate, but is using maybe an iPad or some other kind of accessible communication, child has a right to their home language. Every child has a right to continue their bilingualism. And all of those children are also capable of learning 2 languages.
Yeah.
That's another thing that I often encounter is, oh, well, since he was diagnosed, we were told by so-and-so to just, only speak English because it's easier. Not true. How confused is your child going to be when you've only been speaking to them in your home language and now you suddenly switch to English? Which one is going to be scarier for them? It's going to be you switching.
Yeah, no, for sure. And what's interesting is, I think anyways, that myth is so prevalent that people who are very well educated in many different areas think that that's true. It is not just people who, for lack of a better word, don't have a higher degree or a master's degree or whatever doctorate. It is everyone. Like the amount of people that I've met that really think that that is true at all kind of levels and different, backgrounds and things like that is quite astonishing. And it's sad, quite frankly. And I am definitely one of those people who is like, please stop. Like, please do not keep going on and saying this to other people, because you are actually someone that the community looks to because you are a professional in whatever way you are. And people will listen to you, and you are giving really bad information. So it's actually it's frustrating too, right? Because you know, but if you have an issue and you keep getting told this, then you start doubting yourself too sometimes, because like, well, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I will say in my own practice, as somebody who strives to be culturally and linguistically diverse with my clients, and I don't only work with Polish families, I work with families that speak dozens of languages. Um, it's, like you said, universal. It is something that I think is extremely, I think honestly the biggest factor that we don't really see as clearly is the American culture. Our American culture is very individualistic. Our American culture is very focused on assimilation. As much as we are a melting pot and we celebrate that, we've celebrated that for decades, there is still this kind of a prevailing mindset among, like you said, people of every social class, people of every background, just here in America, that English is the best, that you must be able to, in order to succeed in this country, you must have a great command of English. There is no way that you can succeed here without knowing that.
Yep.
And that's not true in other countries and other cultures. And it's, go to South Asia, go to, there are many countries in West, East, South Africa, North Africa, where it is the norm to speak 3 or 4 languages. And it is just part of the society. It is part of the fabric of their countries. That just isn't true here. So we also have this kind of overlying piece of our culture, or like I said, the collective American culture, that is also kind of influencing the entire process. It's influencing even how I do my job. It wasn't until this year that New York State passed legislation actually 100% codifying into state law that a child who is in a school program, so this is like kindergarten and up, that speaks another language at home must be evaluated in that language along with English. 2024.
Yeah.
In New York State, of all, and in this country that's considered one of the progressive states.
Yes. Yeah.
Where we are, and we're coming from a perspective of what I would call biculturalism, or like multiculturalism, where like you grew up in a bicultural household. You had American culture and Polish culture, not even just talking about languages, but culture.
Yeah.
And that influences, if we're talking about brain development and bilingualism, there's the cognitive benefits, as most people know, cognitive flexibility. That there's different words for different thing, for one thing. So your brain is already primed to learn more information about things because you already understand that one thing can represent many things.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's great for your job prospects, right? You speak multiple languages. Everyone's going to want to hire you because you can communicate with more people. But let's think also about the cultural aspect of that, being able to kind of flip between cultures, being able to flip between mindsets and be more empathetic to your fellow human, because you can understand a different perspective that may not necessarily be evident when you're meeting somebody.
Yeah.
So it's not just about being able to have a good job. It's also about just like being, I would say, a more well-rounded person. Not that monolingual people aren't. It's just different. It's just very different when you're bilingual or multilingual.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to your point, by knowing another language, often at least, another culture, at least to some extent. And, especially if you're an immigrant or you have immigrant parents, you come from a background that's very different from a lot of the people we probably know, or from many people, other people in the US. And so you do have a different perspective on things, right? And so that's why diversity is so important, right? And in my real job outside of Linguati, that's something that we really champion and we really want, because when you have different ideas and different perspectives, that's really where you come up with some really amazing things that maybe no one has ever thought about before, but is a huge need for the population or the community or whatever. And so that's why keeping up with language or keeping up with the culture is important for so many of us, right? As we grow our own families and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and that's just, to speak to the community, right? To speak to we're raising our children. It's interesting because I think this is another thing I often see and I've experienced. I mean, I haven't experienced it myself just because of my own background, but I'm sure there's others that can relate to this that I've seen others, is that you want to raise your kids bilingually in your home language. Say you're an immigrant from another country here. You want to raise your child speaking your language, knowing your culture, but here. And then there's an expectation that by speaking your language all the time, by doing all these things all the time, your child is going to look exactly like, your cousin that's back in the old country. And they're going to, even though they're the same age and they, or that maybe this, maybe they're both girls, both boys, whatever, that because you're raising them so intensely in America, speaking your language, speaking all these things, that they're going to turn out exactly like your cousins, your cousin back in Poland, let's just say. And that's
Yeah.
also something that I often have to talk to parents about, is that you're actually kind of raising them here differently, because just by growing up in a different country, even though you're speaking your language, they are going to have a completely different experience. They're going to
Yeah.
have completely different references for what people are talking about. I
Yeah.
often discuss this with my daughter, as I mentioned before. She attends a dual language program, Polish English, here in Queens. It's
Mhm.
fabulous. Her
So
teacher,
lucky. You're so lucky.
listen, it's like, but also once again, like we had to fight. It's still a fight to keep it going. But her
Yeah.
teachers are just so dedicated and they are so amazing. But we had a really interesting conversation last year about how, you know, we're raising Polish Americans. This is a Polish American program because, in Poland, they don't start school till they're 6. Here, the norm is to start daycare when you're, 6 weeks old or like 1. That
Yeah.
already is setting your child up differently than like a Polish speaking child from Poland. So when we're talking about things like developmental norms, talking about things like, bilingual language development, it's completely different, even from monolingual Polish children, because they are already being exposed to different languages and different cultures. And that continues throughout school. It continues throughout their whole life.
Yeah.
That it is once again like a rubber band. These kids are not going to turn out the same way as your cousin, your cousin back in Poland, because they are Polish American.
Yeah, and there's so many things that play into that, right? I mean, obviously the childcare system here is not the greatest and the most supportive, and so a lot of people make a lot of different decisions because of that. I mean, we are very privileged that we do have my mom with us, and so both of my kids are able to be home full time with her, and again, exposed to Polish pretty much 24/7. Up until about the age of 2.5, which is when we decided that we did want to get them into preschool just to meet other kids and stuff. I mean, my son was born during COVID, so it felt like more of a need at that time, just for the simple fact just to meet other people, not anything else necessarily. Now we have 2, so you don't necessarily need that as much because they have each other. But still, it is a privilege to be able to have even continuous Polish exposure for that long of a period of time. And I've gone back and forth about whether or not, do I send them to preschool now or do I wait or whatever, for, a variety of different reasons. But I've also gone really out of my way to find schools that, unfortunately, in my particular area, we don't have any Polish preschools, but I found Polish teachers at preschool. And so I've been able to do that. So at least they still have some exposure.
Yeah.
And I also feel like, and again, this is my thought process, right? This is not the right fit for everyone. And most kids, pretty much all kids do fine once they go into school. But I did want them to transition into English a little bit more softly.
Yeah.
So without having to go to a school that was all English all the time, straight from coming from home where they only spoke Polish, because we've made that decision as a family. And so if they had a Polish teacher, then at least they could have 1 or 2 people that they're able to communicate with much more easily, and they can get their needs across if they need to, if there's something wrong or whatever. Like, it's also a comfort level for me, as well, and for my husband, obviously. And we've been obviously also very privileged that we've been able to find that. Now it takes work. It was not easy, but we're able to find that. And, now that my son is in all English preschool, I do hear more and more English. And so that's going to change. And I hear like his references are starting to change even about what he's talking about. And it's one, fascinating, and two, like it's a little bit sad for me too, because I'm like, he knew all these Polish references, and even like really funnily, he would talk about like length and height in meters and not in feet.
Oh,
Because all we read are Polish books and everything's written in meters. And it's funny because I have asked me about how long a meter is, I could not freaking tell you. Like, I don't know. It's because I've grown up here and we
yeah,
don't use the metric system.
no,
unless,
exactly.
unless you're in a field that really uses it, right? And so that part of the cultural aspect is so interesting. And I'm really excited to see how else that changes over time, for both of them, right? And for us too, because again, we've been pretty strict about how much Polish we use at home
Yeah,
until this point. But I imagine once they're all in school, that will change and it'll flow a little bit differently, and we'll probably use more Polish. And when it comes to math and science, I'm sure I'll be talking to them in English, because those are not subjects that I know very well in Polish at all.
yeah,
It'll be just interesting, I think, to see that.
yeah. And it really just, everyone's experiences are always like emphasizing that cultural shift and how, and like I said, I always try and also explain to my parents it's not just about the bilingualism of the language, it's also about the culture. Because
Yeah.
that's where the kids start to see that there's a difference, and that's when children start to choose. I wouldn't say choose, but when they start to kind of like learn and absorb and then figure out for themselves which one is going to make the most sense in this situation. Who's going to understand me when I say this? Who's going to know what I'm saying when I talk about this? Or also just let me use this thing that I just learned and maybe I'll get more of a reaction, or not reaction, but like more of a response because more people know what I'm talking about. And
Yeah.
that's kind of really what happens when kids start going to school, especially because you're talking about in many of our communities, we have lots of children speaking different languages, lots of children coming from different backgrounds and cultures at home who are starting kindergarten now. And what is the one unifying thing? American culture and English.
Yeah.
That's really kind of why kids, in many people's experiences, start to kind of like drop their home language, is because
Yeah.
they start to see they see more quote unquote value in speaking English because it is more unifying in that setting. While at home, they might start, that's when we start to kind of see kids starting to, question internally, like, why are we speaking this language? I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this too. I have a lot of friends who the kids started school and they just stopped speaking the home language. They just started responding to everything in English. And then
Yeah.
that causes us to panic, and it causes us to figure out what can we do? How do we quote unquote fix this?
Yeah.
Which creates a new dynamic, a new communication dynamic between a parent and a child. So
Yeah.
all of these things are really difficult to navigate. It's really difficult as a parent to navigate. I don't want to be prescriptive with my children. I don't want to tell them what to do, but this is important to me.
Yeah.
It's hard, especially if you have a child who you suspect has delays or disabilities, or who you have confirmed diagnoses, to not only have this aspect, but then you also have like our ableist society aspect on top of that. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack
Yeah.
emotionally for families. I often find myself acting as a counselor in my sessions with the families because they can finally get out all of these feelings, all of these pent up worries and frustrations and concerns that they haven't been able to really articulate until they have somebody like a speech pathologist who understands and respects the or the multicultural, multilingual process,
Yeah.
because it's very alienating when you don't have that.
Yeah, if you don't have a community, right? And so I think that's super important wherever you are, to be able to find that. And to your point, like English then becomes such a high value, because if your kids' friends are all speaking English, and even if they are maybe speaking other languages at home, then that hopefully helps, because then they all have something else that they have in common, even though it's a different language. But the highest value that they're getting from like a cultural perspective and like a community perspective is coming out of English. So I mean, that's why there are so many Polish schools and so many other Polish communities, but I would say it's important for the parents and for the kids to both have that, right? And to find your group of people that are going to be supportive of it and understand, or at least try to understand, that this is what you're doing and this is really important for you. And again, why it's so great if the kids have someone else that they can actually relate to. And so, with the dual immersion program that you have your daughter in, and I think, is your other daughter going to go next year? Does she start next year or not yet?
18 months. She's going to be starting a daycare, but it's going to be a przedszkola. She's going to start like at a Polish daycare, which is the same.
Okay. So, it's helpful because then they can hopefully have the opportunity to relate culturally, right, with people, with peers from that side and that perspective, right? And it's something that as a child, maybe you don't understand as much or you don't pay attention to as much, but definitely like as I got older, particularly in college, like that's when I really noticed things like that and the differences between um, how I grew up in my house versus how other people grew up in their house, and that there's actually other people who grew up like I did, because we didn't have, for whatever reason, like a large peer community where I grew up, and I did get that when I was in college, and it was just such a different experience then for me. But it took that long, basically, for me to really see it and see the significance of it. And hopefully with our kids, we're doing a good enough job, hopefully, and we're privileged enough to be able to do it because we live in New Jersey, right? So that's still pretty diverse, and we're able to find some of these things. I mean, I imagine if we lived in Alaska or in Tennessee or wherever, it would be much harder to find peers and other just families in general that are speaking more than one language at home. But it's just really important. And one of the things that's really funny, and it's a cultural thing, really, and not necessarily just a Polish thing, but when you read the books, the Polish kids' books, there's a series, Kicia Kocia, which many people are familiar with here. So Kicia Kocia, I think it's Kicia Kocia, nie wiem, coś o jedzeniu, I forget what it is, na dobranoc, czy coś, kolację, czy podwieczorek, ona przygotuje z Nunusiem i idą do lodówki, bo już chce soczek, ten soczek jest w lodówce, to jest za zimne, to nie będziemy pić, tylko będziemy pić herbatkę ciepłą. I'm like, oh my god, if that's not the epitome of like a Polish household, I cannot even.
I know.
My kids don't get it yet, right? They
Grzejemy mleko, grzejemy wszystko, bo wszystko musi być bardzo ciepło.
Wszystko musi być ciepłe, nie ma lodu w niczym, like, it's crazy. And it's funny because moja mama i podobnie moja babcia też bardzo lubiała zimne pić, like, tylko że babcia piła ze studni zimną wodę. Ale lubiała zimne i moja mama i ja też. A mój mąż na przykład, to like try to get him to drink a glass of water with ice in it. It's not happening. On tylko może być woda stojąca albo herbata taka stojąca. Nie może być, żeby było zimne. Like,
no tak.
Może drinki tylko.
No, dokładnie. No, u nas jest, mój mąż jest więcej taki po amerykańsku. So on pije takie rzeczy, bo on jest wychowany tutaj. On przyjechał tutaj z Polski.
No, mąż też niby.
4 lata miał, kiedy przyjechał tutaj z rodzicami. So był a situation, he's very American, like, I mean, on mówi po polsku, like, he speaks perfect Polish, no accent or anything. But it's just funny, like, seeing that. And I think, it's like, if we want to talk about strategies, right, to support these children as they're going through all transitions, as they're growing up bilingually, from our perspective professionally, continue to just provide the best language models that you can in whatever language that is. So I think there's also this perspective, or there's always been this advice for bilingual parents of just like, if you speak that language and you speak one parent, one language, that's one method, right? Like of being bilingual. You have one parent that speaks one that speaks the other. There's many different perspectives. You could have you could just have like target language at home, which is a big one. And that's like a very effective one. of just, which is basically what we've been doing, which is like you just speak the other language at home all the time. The target language for us is Polish, right? So it's like we watch Disney Plus po polsku. We watch like Peppa Pig, Świnka Peppa po polsku, like being po polsku. Everything is in Polish.
Yeah.
We constantly are reading to her to give her that other perspective, as you are, and why Linguati and these things are so important, because you're giving that literacy that they will not get here in an English-speaking, English majority country, and making that normal and just making that part of your family fabric. You know what I mean? And I think that's probably the most important advice, because we also have to consider that there are some people who speak languages that may not have a written system, right? So like their perspective and their culture is built differently from us in that way as well, but it is not valid. So the advice I would give kind of across the board is just speak whatever language you're comfortable in whatever situation it is. So for you don't feel comfortable doing math and science in Polish? Cool. That's fine. Do it in English, because you want your child to learn what we call a good model, and your model and what you're able to provide for him that will help him understand the material is in English. But maybe for your husband, that's Polish. You know what I mean? So it's like, your child is not going to lack anything just because you're not speaking whatever language it is that you want him to in that moment. You can find other ways to supplement that, right? Other strategies are just, encouraging, encouraging familial connections if possible, showing your child that it's just, it's not just like with you or with somebody else, making friends in your community that are going to be of similar linguistic background and culture and experience background, kind of like what you mentioned, where it's like we're having all these little Polish American kids now, it's different. We're in the second generation of these kids. Having them connect with each other so that they can kind of create their own little community too. If we want them to continue the culture, continue our language, they have to connect with each other, because they're going to be the ones that are going to be talking to each other in 10, 15 years. I think the biggest piece of advice I can give parents, it's not necessarily a strategy, but it's like, don't give up and just basically do what works for you. Just do what works for you. Do not feel any, it's so hard to not feel guilty. It's so hard to not feel ashamed of yourself when you feel like you want to do something for them that you can't, whether it's like, oh, I really wanted to tell him this in Polish, I don't remember it. But just do the best that you can and just give yourself grace, because the more stress that you add to it, children pick up on that. They pick up on stress. They pick up on, these little conflicts that we have going on internally. And we don't want to pass that down to them either, because that is something we can pass on. But let's take that out of it. Let's do that for our kids and try and take that anxiety and take that shame away and instill pride instead.
So, you mentioned accent before, that your husband doesn't have one, and you just talked about shame. Can you talk a little bit about that? And, obviously a lot of us who have grown up here, mamy jakiś akcent po polsku, jak mówimy, because I think mine is not that prominent, and I can trick people often because they can't really tell. And I don't know why. It's not like I've worked on my accent in any way. That's just how I talk, and for whatever reason. Now, I will say I also get told very often, now less so, but especially like in my teen years and 20s, that I have an accent when I speak English. So this is very, I think, what's the word?
Loaded question.
It's a loaded question, but it's also, whoever you talk to, they have an accent, right? They have their own accent. They talk whatever way they talk. So again, like I've been told I have an accent even in English, and I was born and raised here, lived in New Jersey literally my whole life, except for 1 year in Pittsburgh. And like I get told I have an accent in English even. It doesn't stop me from speaking English to anyone necessarily, right? It's also not really necessarily significant enough. But I know for like a lot of my peers, if they were born here, they feel some type of way when they speak Polish to other people, right? And especially like the elders in our community, and they like to make comments and stuff, right? And it can be really frustrating, and it can be really something that's also a barrier for them to be speaking Polish to their kids, because they're like, well, I don't want to teach them the wrong Polish anyway, or I don't want them to pick up my accent or whatever. So do you have kind of a perspective on that from, from your SLP side, from the professional side?
Yeah, I would say that so every single person on this planet has an accent. So accent just means it's like it's a variation within like a standard dialect, right? So like we speak American English. You and I right now are speaking a New York dialect or like a New York, New Jersey, like tri-state area. There is a described in research literature dialect to this area. So, and then there's also a dialect, there's a Southern dialect. There's like California, there's so many dialects and accents. I mean, go to England and
Yeah.
every other town has their own accent. Historically, accents have been used as kind of like power moves, right? So it's like, oh, you have this accent. That must mean you're from this place. It means that you're this kind of person. I'm going to treat you a certain way. So that's historically kind of like how it's been weaponized, I would say, against people. Same thing, for people who've immigrated here. Oh, you have this accent. You're not from here. I already can tell by you speaking that you're not from here, and I'm going to treat you a certain way. Even if it is unconscious, even if it is, not something necessarily malicious, but maybe then you start speaking much more slower than you would to someone else, but that person still understands you, even when you were speaking quickly. And now they feel even more self-conscious because they know that you heard their accent and now you're changing how you're talking. So like, I would say from an SLP perspective, there is the whole realm of what has been called in the past, like accent modification. That is a service that some speech therapists offer. Usually it's on a request basis, what does that mean? That means that the client must request it. We're not going to go to somebody, or I wouldn't consider it ethical to go to somebody and say, you know what, like, I really can't understand what you're saying. And like, you really should go to accent management classes. Like that's just, so, but it does happen, and it has happened to people I know. But I would say from our perspective, like if you truly feel like your accent is hindering like how you're interacting in your life, it's hindering you professionally. That's like a big one for adults, especially, is like it's hindering how I communicate with people in my job, and like I'm not getting a promotion because they can't understand me. You can find people that will like help you with that.
Yeah.
In terms of kids and growing up that way, I think it just becomes part of our responsibility, like as a community, and also just professionally, just to kind of keep reinforcing that, like, you still got to keep doing it. Find someone that you feel comfortable with speaking in whatever language it is, and just keep talking to them like that until you get whatever you think means better, or until you kind of stop feeling that shameful feeling. I think, like I said, from an SLP perspective, accents aren't really something that in this day and age that like I would comment on.
Okay.
It really doesn't impede communication that much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, for those of us who are first, second generation and we're teaching our kids and we do have an accent, an American accent, we speak Polish, I don't think it should necessarily hinder you from speaking Polish to your kids. If your goal is for them to speak Polish and you are speaking Polish, you just have an accent. That's it. And I mean, the thing is, the more you speak it, the more comfortable you get, because like, again, I even see in myself, like I thought I spoke pretty well, and my Polish has gotten a lot better over the last 4 years because I've had 4 years of like extra practice, basically.
Exactly.
Now I'm not just talking to my mom in Polish, because quite frankly, I don't really talk to my siblings in Polish all that much. I usually talk to them in English, quite frankly. But I'm talking now to my husband in Polish, my mom in Polish, my 2 kids in Polish. That's 4 people that I'm now communicating with on a daily basis in Polish. And so I've gotten more comfortable, and you get more comfortable even if you do have an accent. I would say like it's not as big of a hindrance, to your point, as you may think it is, because if your goal is for your kids to be understood, then if they go to Poland, they have an accent, people will still be able to understand them. Or if they meet someone who speaks Polish in their job, so like, for example, they become an SLP and they have people they're supporting in the Polish community, they'll still be able to communicate with them. It's fine if they have an accent. That person, if they're not able to communicate in English, is going to be, I think, so happy that they can at least speak to someone who understands them and is able to actually have a conversation with them in their language that they're more comfortable with.
You're 100% right. I see it all the time. I mean, like, I'll give perspective from my other languages. Like French, I speak fluently. And I studied it. I learned it when I lived in Europe as a child. I went to a bilingual preschool that was English and French. When we came back to this country, I continued learning French like in middle school, high school, studied it in college. It was my minor. Like I did a lot of work with like reading and writing. So it's actually funny. I feel like I speak French better than I speak Polish. Like I feel like I'm way more bilingual in French because I can read and write it very fluently. I
Mm.
reports, SLP reports in French. So, I mean, that's kind of like the level that I'm at with that. I currently at my job do have a French speaking patient. And it's just so interesting to exactly what you just said is that like every time I walk into that room, I am getting a list of 80 things that are going on because she cannot or doesn't feel comfortable communicating with anybody else, even with an interpreter.
Yeah.
I'll always say to her, like, do you have any questions? She goes, well, if you're here, and then she gives me a bunch. It is my pleasure to help her. Like I'm there to support not just her child, but to support her.
Yeah.
And same thing when I've worked in the Polish community in EI. You know, my Polish is not amazing. I'm at the point now where my 6-year-old daughter has told me, Mommy, stop speaking Polish because it's not that good. She only speak Polish to my husband and to my in-laws and to like my grandparents and to like, I mean, I try my best. I'm still trying. And so what we just said, I'm still speaking to her in Polish. I'm still doing it.
Yeah.
It's fine. I get what you're saying. And I've explained to her that mommy is learning too, and you can help mommy.
Yeah. I mean, I just laugh because like the kids are just so funny and they're so real.
They're just so blunt. He's just like, you know what? It's not that great. But also, like to her point, like she is speaking beautifully, and like she
Yeah.
definitely is more advanced than I am. But like, you know, it's a journey anyway. So like, it is a blessing, and it does happen often where a family is just happy to have you there. In many
Yeah.
cases, you know, going back to your initial point, you know, a while ago, like a lot of them do speak a lot of English that they don't realize that they speak or that they
Yeah.
know. So oftentimes I find that these conversations, not all the time, there are many situations where it's like monolingual and we are speaking one language, but it does happen sometimes where it's like we end up speaking kind of a mix because it's like they might know certain things. I mean, I worked with a patient in my hospital, a child whose mother was from Poland, and it was funny because like she and I would the term is called code switching. Code switching is when you're switching between languages. So like
Mm.
she's so funny because this was years ago when my Polish also was like it was fine, but like it wasn't amazing, or it's still not amazing, but you know what I mean? It's not as good. It's so funny because like she and I would code switch constantly in one
Mm.
conversation. Like she would say one thing to me in Polish, I would say it back in English, but then I would ask her something in Polish and then she would say it back to me in English because it was something that the doctor had asked and the doctor spoke to her in English about it.
Yeah.
So, you know what I mean? And that's like and you know, another myth to bust is that like code switching is 100% normal. Code switching is normal. It's valid. It is an expression of language. We all learn in different ways. And even if you don't think you code switch because you're monolingual, think about how you speak to your dad or your mom versus how you speak to your teacher. You're already code switching.
Yeah.
You're going to use different words. You're going to be more polite, or like you're going to be, you know, maybe your accent is stronger with your family if you're like, you know, from a certain, like say you're from New York, from the South. How many times do you go back and you're like, oh my gosh, like so you know, a couple of drinks and you're like, oh my goodness, it's not like I'm from Bensonhurst. You know what I mean? It changes. So,
Yeah.
you know, code switching is not a sign of a delay. Code switching is not a sign that the child is learning something incorrectly. It is a sign that the child is acquiring it, that the child is learning it and is learning how to apply it, which is why then it becomes so important for us as parents to just model what we know best.
Yeah.
Continue to model without expectations. That's the big thing too, without expectations. One thing I always tell parents is like, get say out of your vocabulary. There's no say this, say that. Just
Yeah.
to them in the moment when it's happening, because otherwise it's not relevant.
Yeah.
Telling to say like, oh, like say banana, but like there's no banana around you. Why would your kid say banana?
Yeah.
You know what I
That's
mean?
really hard to do, actually, right?
It's super hard. It's so hard. And it's funny because like even as a therapist, like it took me like a good year or two to like kind of wrap my head around how I now like talk with my patients and my clients. Like it
Mhm.
takes effort, and it takes, and also to go back to the initial point that we discussed is that like bilingualism and all these things take effort. It takes,
Yeah.
you know, it does take some kind of like, okay, I want them to know this. I need to do it this way. Like you have to think about it, even if it is you are speaking one language at home because you only speak one language, you don't speak English, you still understand that like the outside speaks English and you have to kind of support your child in one language. You know what I mean? So even if you
Yeah.
don't think that like, oh, I don't have a plan, we're just doing what we do, you do though. You are following a plan. You just don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thinking about it somewhere along the line. And I think it also changes as, again, time goes on, right? Maybe initially if you're in the thick of it and that's the only language you speak, then yeah, that's what you're not necessarily thinking about it so much because that's the only language you know. But eventually you do learn more and your kids are learning more because they're bringing it home. So maybe you're actually learning from them. And so
Exactly.
you start thinking about it, right? And the dynamic is always changing. And to your point when we first started is bilingualism is really dynamic. It changes so much, and for us as adults, for us as parents, and then also for our kids, and that's okay, and that's totally normal, which I think is the key, right, for people to really kind of understand and take away.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've kind of started talking about a little bit was don't say this or don't say that. Um, so that's often again in bilingual homes, right? When you have a home language and your child does start going to an English speaking school and they start bringing in the English language at home, and you're starting to get resistance in speaking the home language. Do you have any tips that you can share with us, basically from maybe an SLP perspective as a parent? Maybe the immersion school has kind of provided some information on that. I'm not sure. But if you have any kind of tips and things, I think that's really helpful because I know there are a lot of misconceptions about what to do or not do in those situations.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest thing is just to like continue with what is most comfortable for you. You know what I mean? Like continue speaking your home language. The biggest thing I would say is probably not to shame your child for speaking English, because this is how maybe like a more dysfunctional dynamic can start a little bit is if we start panicking and start kind of like pushing too much or kind of like getting upset about it. We have to understand that that is a normal process and that like that's just what's going to happen. Just and understand that it's going to happen at some point. Don't make it a thing of like if, make it a when. And when it does, the best thing to do really is to just keep speaking your language, keep reading your books. I would say actually the biggest one, another big reason besides the culture and besides like the value, right, is that once you get to school, you start to learn how to read. And that is something that I don't think people understand is like a huge game changer for kids. Is once they learn how to read, they can now access the world around them without needing as much help from you. You don't need to tell them anymore, like, what does that say? Or like, what is happening? Because they can now read. So think
Yeah.
about the power that is behind that, right? Think about the power that is behind being able to access something on your own without needing mom or dad to help you. You can now go on mom's phone and you can read her text messages. Like, I mean, just simple things. Oh yeah, my daughter texts now. It's like great.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, really
I
interesting.
cannot.
Yeah,
I'm not ready. I'm not ready.
yeah. But really what it is that that's why like I would say another big reason why some kids end up not ever really achieving full fluency or the fluency that they want to in their home language is once you hit that barrier without literacy, it's really hard to overcome that emotionally. It's really hard to overcome that like with time and learning, right? So
Hmm.
things like Linguati books, other opportunities in the community to learn how to read
Yeah.
is a huge game changer. I really feel like that's one of the main reasons why my daughter's Polish fluency is still so good is that she can read and write in it. She wrote a book last week for her
Oh,
class. Like that
congratulations.
they had an assignment. They had to write a book, Jak to zrobić. You had to do a how-to book in 4 steps with like pictures. She did the entire thing independently in 2 hours.
Wow.
But that's because like, it's part of her curriculum. It's part of what she's learning. But
Yeah.
not
And
a lot of kids get that. So really think about, or like I would say to parents, like the literacy piece of it is going to be important because if your kid cannot access that independently, their first language may stay at that level for a long time. I'll put it that way. And that's
yeah.
also something else that, we learn about when we're learning about bilingualism is things like language attrition, first language. Hello?
Yep.
Okay, I froze. Everything's frozen, but on a really
Yeah.
weird picture. But okay. Um, it is not uncommon for kids to kind of lose their first language. And most of the time it's because of the literacy. Most of the time it's because they're learning how to read and write in English and doing things in English, and it may not always transfer over to the second language. So
Yeah.
that is, like I said, that is another reason why it's so important.
Yeah.
Am I moving? Because like I said, I'm frozen.
You're not. Let me see. I'm gonna remove you from the stage and then add you back in. So just one sec. Okay, some technical difficulties. Hopefully. Now it's just black. I don't know if that's better.
Maybe on my end, let me stop the cam and restart it.
Okay.
No, it's not working.
I don't know why.
Oh, mine's frozen completely. Okay, I'll just keep talking. Just because we only have a few minutes left. There are just, I mean, I don't want to override anything, but there are, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
The one thing I do want to talk about really quickly is like causes for concern in bilingual kids. When do you refer? When do you say, you know what, I think that there is an issue and like I don't know what to do. So just to know, early intervention, if we're talking about littles between the ages of 0 and 3, is free in every state. You can usually call like your state or county commissioner and get a number that you can call. That will give you the information. If kids are in preschool age, which we consider 3 to 5, it will usually be handled by the preschool special education for whatever county you live in. Even though it says special education, all it means is that the services are under the umbrella of that department in the county.
Okay.
School age, it's the Committee of Special Education. Once again, not that your child may need special education, but just the service providers and the services are under that umbrella. You can always also go private. You can always go like to a medical facility if you feel like it's something different, especially if it's like a feeding issue, go to a hospital. Bilingual children develop just as monolingual children do. So the norms that you see for monolingual children, they also acquire similar sounds. They will acquire like what we call our bilabial, our ba-ba-ba, ma-ma-ma, pretty early. A lot of sh type, even because across languages, those are common sounds. Vowels, o, u. They will usually start using words by 1. They usually will start putting together words by 2. If you have a vocabulary between 50 and 100 words, across both languages. What does across mean? It means that maybe 50 of those words are in Polish, maybe 50 of those words are in English, but together you have 100. So what you see is once they have about 50 to 100 words, they will start putting words together. Want this, no mommy, things like that, very small things. By 3, they're usually using sentences, answering questions, identifying colors, shapes. Well, not shapes necessarily, but maybe usually like colors, body parts is a big one, and able to follow like simple routine commands in the house. Even if you're bilingual, if you notice that your child is not doing those things, if you notice that your child maybe is not paying attention to things when you're paying attention to them, like you say, look over there, they're not looking. If you notice that your child is maybe using like large chunks of words or songs to mean different things, those could be causes for referral. And like I said, that's across bilingual children, multilingual, monolingual. Those are for all kids. Generally, bilingual children will develop similarly. They may what we call code switch, as we just talked about. They may combine words from different languages together. That's fine. That's completely normal. They should be doing that. It's when you really notice that there's maybe some, I wouldn't even call them speech things, like other things that are kind of catching your eye. Like I said, maybe not paying attention to things as much. Maybe they have like really big emotional outbursts that are really hard to control. Because they can't communicate, whether it's that they aren't understanding what's going on, if they're using a lot of pointing and gestures, if they're using lots of vowel sounds like oh, but no consonants for a long time, like maybe 3, like that's a cause for concern.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what the timeline looks like from that initial call, which by the way, it is a call, at least in New Jersey, because I thought we could just like go and request early intervention, because we've actually been through early intervention with our youngest, more precautionary just to make sure that we're not missing anything. And I was actually really surprised that it is a phone call. There's like no request form just send. So I think that's something that's kind of important to know, because I was expecting I'd be able to just fill something out like quickly in between things. But you do have to make a phone call. I mean, it was super easy. It's just, we're millennials and talking to people over the phone is actually really weird now.
I mean, so in New York, I'll speak for New York because that's where I've worked. You can call 311 in New York City and they will give it to you. They also have other languages on standby. So if you don't speak English, that is also not a barrier to this. You have access to early intervention. I also want to emphasize, if you are undocumented, but your child was born here, or even if your child is undocumented, you are entitled to early intervention. It does not change your immigration status. They do not ask about that. It is not. I've worked with cases where that was a concern for their delay in referring because they were afraid that if they called, that somebody would come to the house and they would get reported. But it has nothing to do with that. In New York City, you call 311. If you speak another language, you can find someone. They usually will have like a touch tone. You find what language you speak, and then yes, they will refer you to the county. You have a phone call with them, and you explain your concerns. They'll refer you to a case manager. I don't know if New Jersey is the same, but you get a case manager who kind of like handles getting the evaluations, which ones you need. I know in New York you can speak to Jersey, but I'm pretty sure that like most of them you do like a psychosocial. So there's like a developmental person that comes and talks to you just about overall development. Yep. And then whatever the actual concern is, say that you had concerns with walking, but speaking is fine, then they would get a physical therapist to come. If the concern is speaking, but they're walking fine, then it would be speech. And they would do their own evaluation in addition to this like psychosocial developmental evaluation. And it's supposed to be completed within like 45 to 60 days, depending on the state. That is because of the age of the children. Those children, they change month to month. It is really important to get services started as early as possible because the timeline is pretty quick. It really, one reason I love working in EI is that you see so much progress because they are developing so quickly at that age anyway. And we're just there to support you. We're there to support your child. We're there to support you through this journey, whatever the journey may be. But generally we see like a lot of progress pretty quickly because your child is already developing and we're really just like figuring out, okay, in this stage, what do they need? In this stage, what do they need? So, and if say your child does not qualify, they usually will follow up with you anyway within 3 to 6 months, because if nothing has changed, say your child had a very slight delay, they're like, you know what, like she's like 2 or 3 months behind, but I can't qualify her on that because it's not enough to warrant services. They will call you again in 3 to 6 months. And if your child has kind of stayed the same, then they'll start services. If your child has made progress during that time, wonderful. We're so happy. We'll call you again in 3 to 6 months, and they will keep monitoring and keeping tabs on what's going on.
Yeah, and I think, the importance for a lot of parents here is start as early as you can if you think there's something, because not our experience, but partially why we even went to early intervention was we didn't want to age out. And so to your point, there's other services as they get older, but I'm kind of my own personal experiences babysitting in the past with kids who have special needs and needed more care. The earlier you start them, you see such a big difference in terms of quality of life, communication, being able to do all these different things much earlier on. And it makes everyone in the family a little bit less apprehensive, and it makes things, I feel like, a little bit easier the earlier you start. And again, if you do wait and you find out at 2 years and 9 months, I feel like, it does take 45 to 60 days. And so then you're now aging out of early intervention. Now you have to start something new a month in, right?
With that age is they'll just refer you straight to CPSE. They won't even do anything for EI because they're like, if your kid's turning 3 in 3 months, you might as well just start the preschool process already.
Yeah. So, that's something I think for some parents to really consider, because again, we've heard that happen. And so, if you think there might be something, at least our experience here in New Jersey was we're happy to come out and double check basically to see if there's anything going on, or if there are any needs that your family needs, which was really helpful. And if they don't qualify, they still give you tips in terms of how else to support your child in the things that you think they need support in, whether it's language, whether it's physical therapy, or whatever it is, which is really helpful as well, because some kids just take a little bit longer, and it's totally fine. They're in the normal, range of acquiring different skills. But just having that support sometimes feels really good, right? Because you just have more information and more resources at your tips to be able to do the best that you can for your child. And that's what most parents, I think, want to do, right, for their kids.
Yeah.
But the process in New Jersey was very similar. So I mean, a phone call, then I got referred to the county, and then we set up a meeting, and it was like a behavioralist, I think, and then we had the speech pathologist as well on site. And by the way, she was asking questions, and they didn't have anyone in Polish. They were asking them in English, but I was there to ask everything in Polish. And I mean, I understood both languages, so for us that wasn't, a huge issue. But I'm sure if we needed someone Polish, then we would have been able to figure that out or had an interpreter or something, I think.
Yeah, in New York, the way it is that you can't interpret for your child, but you can bring somebody else like in your family to interpret for them. So say like, you're in New York City, what they would have done is they would have said, okay, like have your mom come, or like have someone else that speaks both come and interpret for your kid. Okay. Or they would bring an actual, I mean, the gold standard is to bring their own interpreter. That's just not always possible. So those are kind of the options that you have. Also, they really try, at least in New York, to find bilingual therapists to do the evaluations on bilingual kids. So in New York, there's the bilingual extension to the TSSLD, which is for school-age children. I can say right now, I actually don't have it because at my job, it's just not necessary because I don't work in a school. It's just extra certification to be certified that you can work with bilingual kids, but it's not necessary for early intervention. So like I said, for myself, like I'm bilingual and multilingual, I don't have this, but I still get the bilingual cases because they know that I speak. I've demonstrated my competency in these other languages, so I still get those cases.
Yeah. Yeah, no. So, I mean, I think we don't have that many Polish SLPs, especially for early intervention in New Jersey, at least as far as I know, because I've checked. But there's still ways to do it, and I think there's a lot of resources out there for parents to go out and if you do have concerns, to be able to get them kind of evaluated and make sure you're getting the resources and help that you need for your family.
Yeah, and also, I'm sorry, one last thing for EI is you can self-refer. You don't need a doctor. If you have concerns, you can call. It doesn't have to. You don't have to have your doctor agree. Whatever, you can call yourself as a parent, and you don't have to get permission.
Yeah, that's actually a big one. Thank you for reminding us about that. Okay. Yeah. So we're already over an hour, so I don't want to keep anyone too much longer. But it was really, really great speaking with you, Ciara. And I really appreciate your time. And for talking to us about your bilingualism journey, yours with your kids, and then also just talking to us about the SLP logopeda perspective in terms of what that looks like and what does early intervention look like here in the States and all those things, and what resources are available for parents who do have concerns, because it does sometimes come up. And then kind of doing some myth busting as well, because that's also really important. For a lot of people to know that bilingualism does not cause delays.
No, it's not.
If people take away that and that early intervention is there to help you, I think we've done a solid job today.
Yes, agreed.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining.
Bardzo dziękuję, Gabi. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Okay. Do zobaczenia.
Do zobaczenia.